Let your governorial training begin.
Caesar 3, or Caesar III if you want to be weird about it, is a game that stands the tests of time by presenting players with an appealing aesthetic that would go on to inspire 3 distinct follow-ups using the same basic game formula in Pharaoh, Zeus, and Emperor. For many of you, this game doesn't even need an introduction, but if you happen to have never heard of Caesar 3 before, it's a city builder puzzle game where you work your way up through the ranks, building progressively more complicated cities and defending the Empire of Rome until you are crowned Caesar. Or rather, that is the larger plot of the game that you'll only end up seeing if you put in the time to learn about the many complicated game systems that work in tandem to make a difficult challenge that feels so rewarding to finally learn and beat. This is an old school game in every sense of the phrase, but many of the quirks and bugs that plagued the title miraculously happened to enhance the problem-solving nature of the series. If you want to know how Caesar 3 stacks up in 2020, then I hope you enjoy this game critique and analysis by JBJett. I feel like I need to begin this analysis by first explaining why Caesar 3 exists as more of a city puzzle game than a city builder. I've always perceived the best known city builder games to be the old SimCity games, followed by City Skylines in the modern day, but the majority of those games revolve around players being given a free sandbox to play in with all the tools they could ever want to make the city of their dreams. While in Skylines, they would end up eventually adding in scenarios via DLC over a year and a half after the game initially released. The general appeal of most city builders lies in the sandbox nature of them. Over the years, city builders have started to work their way towards a more challenging struggle to survive type of mentality with games like Banished or Surviving Mars. But in essence, the same freeform sandbox mode is the focal point of all these adventures. Juxtaposed to the sandbox style of city builder, Caesar 3 happens to be one of the best examples of what I would call the city puzzle genre. The game is divided into 2 campaigns with 11 missions that progressively present the player with harder challenges to overcome in either a peaceful or warlike rise to power. In between each mission, you have the option to switch between peaceful cities and war cities, but I think that following one storyline all the way through and then the other provides a much better experience for the game, so I'll be referring to them as the peace campaign and the war campaign accordingly. The differences between the 2 campaigns are not as large as you would expect, since the peaceful cities do still happen to be attacked from time to time, so the main distinction between each playthrough lies in the size and density of your cities. The peace campaign often led to difficult trading situations and food distribution problems, while the war campaign challenged me to develop large populations within a very small area in order to better defend against enemy attacks from all sides. While these distinctions do lead to some interesting considerations in how you develop your cities, the true challenge to the game lies in how badly it teaches its core concepts to the game. Caesar 3 introduces each of its tools like laying roads, houses, temples, and farms very well by holding back these tools until you need them over the first couple tutorial-style missions with floating text blocks and some surprisingly good visual representations. The true problem starts to come up when they first introduce the walker system and the relative nonchalance that they present it with, like it isn't the most important thing to understand in the whole game. See, most of the mechanics rely on the movement of specific characters from one point to another, such as an immigrant moving from the edge of the map to an open house, or a farmer moving his goods from the orchard to the granary. Every single task in Caesar 3 is carried out via a character walking between 2 locations, with the sole exception of water, which works in a zone distribution system more like the SimCity games. While at first this may seem like a simple implementation of path to destination artificial intelligence, it gets much more complicated when you take into account that any walkers that don't have a specific destination will go in a random direction at each and every intersection. You would think that they would go where they are needed most in order to try and fulfill the needs of as many houses at once, but they are well and truly random, even to the point where walkers can alternate how far they walk on any particular trip from their building. This then puts the player in charge of manipulating the walker AI into taking consistent routes, thus efficiently using the usually limited workforce numbers in each map. This becomes a true learning challenge since the beginning of the game has such low standards that it lets you get away with some really disgusting and inefficient setups while still providing success, reinforcing the poor play in those earlier missions. It's only when you get to the later missions with much harder prosperity requirements that you start to find the challenge of providing schools, food, religion, firemen, engineers, doctors, waters, baths, pottery, furniture, libraries, theaters, and amphitheaters to each and every house on a block to even reach moderate levels of house population. Suffice to say, the standard block intersection city that you might find resembling realistic layouts are often incredibly poor choices for Caesar 3. Instead, the most efficient housing designs use circular roads so that walkers will reach more houses on their way back from each trip, since they take the shortest route back home instead of retracing their steps. The second major concept that you have to learn the hard way is that resources take up space in the game. Every cart of wheat, timber, and wine are all accounted for in a granary, warehouse, or being transported in someone's arms at every point in time. And if there is nowhere to put these resources, then the production facility will simply stop producing until there is more storage room. At the same time, you can't develop too much storage room because granaries and warehouses all take workers to operate, which could have been better used elsewhere. You'll then want to set those granaries and warehouses to accept certain goods and not others, since it prevents an iron worker from wandering across half the map in order to put his goods into the only warehouse that has open room near the end of a mission. It's on this sub-menu of warehouses that you'll also find the option of getting resources, where a warehouse can be tasked with sending out their own carts in order to go take resources from warehouses set to accepting a resource. If this seems complicated, I wouldn't worry about it too much, since controlling the resources doesn't become a real problem until you start trying to supply 8 different resources to one specific luxury palace area near the end of the campaign. The third major concept that the game fails to explain in its entirety is the evolution of housing at higher levels. The first couple missions do a fine job of introducing the idea that supplying food to your houses will enable them to upgrade and hold more people. But the housing evolution starts to get more complicated when the high-density houses start developing into luxury villas. At this point, when you start to introduce wine to housing, it will actually start to hold fewer people, taking up more space via 3x3 or 4x4 blocks and require increasingly more complicated accommodations. The rewards for satisfying those needs lie in extremely good taxes from that housing, as well as large improvements to the prosperity rating for your city, which is often the last thing you'll need to improve in order to win a map, and the last major concept that rules the game: the win conditions. Each map requires 5 stats in order to receive a promotion and move on to the next mission: population, culture, prosperity, peace, and favor. Population is relatively easy to explain and will end up determining the size of the winning city based on how many blocks of housing you'll have to develop. Culture depends on certain ratios like how many working libraries, schools, and theaters you have compared to the number of people in the city. Prosperity is probably the hardest rating to understand for newer players, since it's determined by the average housing level of every house in the city, and often requires specialized housing blocks for villas and palaces before you can win many of the later missions in the game. Peace is determined based on how long your city has gone without being torn down by invaders or rioting citizens, and is generally only a timer unless you struggle with the military invasions. Finally, favor is raised by supplying goods to Rome as soon as you can after Caesar asks for them, giving unrequired gifts to Caesar, or sending legions to defend allied cities under attack. With all that said and done, you would think that knowing how these game systems work would allow you to simply breeze through the game because we've already put in a decent number of minutes into simply understanding the bones of Caesar 3, but putting it into action is a much more complicated affair than simply learning about it. Over the course of the 70 hours it took me to beat both campaigns, I probably also spent around 20 hours or so just watching videos by Gamer Zakhs in order to learn some of the more complicated techniques and tricks for the game. I started learning the radius of fountains was 7x7 on desert maps, but 9x9 on temperate and lush maps. I learned that on lush maps there is never any fire to worry about, so you don't have to use prefectures, which are the Roman word for firemen. I learned that the buildings which train entertainment employees like actor colonies and gladiator schools can supply those entertainment values to houses along the route to their final place of employment. Gatehouses can prohibit the passage of walkers that don't have a specific destination. Warehouses set to getting do not need roads in between destinations at all, and so you can use them to spread goods in between unconnected blocks, and a myriad of other small tricks to eke out the last couple of percentage points on a stat or two. Despite putting in more effort to learn this game than almost any other strategy game I've played, every peace mission felt like a genuine challenge that would leave me cheering as I eventually stumbled across the finish line. I felt like my experience with the game is actually quite typical for most people who ended up learning just enough to beat the campaigns. I started out the first couple of missions playing my way through each challenge with a typical modern street setup with multiple intersections at key points without really thinking about my layout or really understanding the existence of walkers. It works for maybe 3 missions or so before you start to run into genuine problems with your city bursting into fire or going under riots as your workforce starts to reach higher levels of unemployment and you just can't understand why. It was at this point that I started to watch tutorial videos like Gamer Zakhs in order to understand what I was missing, and built a couple of good enough cities to get me through these early missions with low prosperity requirements. The main things I learned on these early maps were how to set up trade routes and sell goods to make money, as well as the weird fact that a workplace with access to even just a single house actually has access to the entire workforce, which takes a while to wrap your head around. And that was all good enough until I got to Lugdunum. According to the forums, I am absolutely not alone in meeting a very real difficulty cliff in the Rocky Mountains of the Peace Campaign's 4th mission, and many players simply ended their experience with Caesar 3 on this map. The real struggle of Lugdunum is that I think it introduces too many new concepts at the same time for new players. It introduces wolves that will attack any walkers that come close enough to them and can end up eating entire lines of immigrants if you're not expecting it. It's the first lush map type in the northern campaign, so you probably don't know that you don't even have to place prefectures on this map. It's the first map that introduces natives in the peace campaign, which can require some unique considerations as you build embassies to pacify them, and then try to build around them without obstructing the embassy's pathing. The mission places most of the farmland along the high ridge down the center of the map in an awkward position away from any good areas for housing. And finally, it requires you to start producing furniture for the very first time in the game to develop a prosperity rating high enough to win the mission. To give some comparisons, the prosperity rating for Lugdunum and the prosperity rating for the final mission in the military campaign are basically the same, despite the difference between the 4th and the 11th mission, respectively. This map eventually ended up taking me 2 retries and around 10 hours in total to beat the first time, with a timestamp that ran so high that I had 200,000 denarii to my name by the time I actually completed the mission. My relief was palpable by the time I finally finished the challenge, and even then it felt like I had only just barely squeaked out the win on the map. Despite this random hurdle in the game's difficulty, I feel like it does a good job of serving as a roadblock to make sure that you understand all the methods you'll need in order to eventually beat the peace campaign. In the next 6 missions of the Peace campaign, I didn't necessarily learn any new concepts, but more so refined the existing knowledge I had developed from Lugdunum into different scenarios and constraints, eventually becoming faster and faster in each map to reach the win conditions. While some of the harder missions near the mid-game while you're still learning the ropes can take 6 to 10 hours and multiple sessions, once you get the hang of the game, every mission can be beaten in 3 hours or less, essentially letting players pick up a mission and complete it all within the same sitting. While missions may end up getting quicker with time, the entire setup for the game leads to each map playing like a house of cards, where forgetting even one small detail can lead to catastrophic disaster. While many players meet disaster through one of the scripted events like major invasions, the absolute worst thing that happened to me was when I cut off half of my city from the rest of the map by pure mistake. Since the entire game is based on the overarching walker system, the immigration and emigration of new workers also requires them to literally walk from the signpost to Rome to the location where there's open lodging, or the reverse when your houses inevitably get unstable and devolve in size. Rarely this can become a genuine problem when your buildings block off a section of housing from the road to Rome. The game does attempt to alert you that something has gone wrong, but in the case of the third to last military mission in Damascus, I happened to think I had blocked in the city in a different location from where I had actually done so, and the game responded accordingly. The developers ended up putting together a crude solution to the lack of pathing between a house and Rome, and so they determined that the easiest way to fix the situation would be to destroy buildings between your housing and the road, which can sometimes lead you to losing a couple blocks of buildings in a worst case scenario. The second thing that can happen is that half the population of your entire city can simply disappear. I was stunned to suddenly see that I was short by around 4,000 employees, virtually unexplainably, as all of my houses on the western side of the map just disappeared. I quickly resettled all the main housing blocks and was able to weather the unemployment crisis by eating into my stockpiles of goods without too much of a struggle, but then the game quickly reminded me that all my industry housing had also been wiped out by the disappearance. See, for most industrial blocks, you don't actually want them to be too close to your real housing, since industrial buildings lower the desirability of the surrounding area, and instead it's much easier to place 1 or 2 tents on the end of a road to supply employees to the entire block of industry using the global worker pool. This makes more sense once you realize that workplaces will literally send out brown walkers to walk the streets and find housing of any type in order to draw from the total population count for unemployment. But going back to my own little slice of hell, I was working on the luxury palace half of my city in order to reach the prosperity requirement when I kept hearing the sound effect for splashing that indicates that a fire is being put out, but I just couldn't seem to find it on the map. And then I saw the charred remains of what used to be all my farmland. Thankfully, my respawning workforce happened to be at the same time as my workplaces were burning to the ground, so it made a nice equilibrium as I quickly rebuilt my industry and rose in population back up to the points that I was just at before these mistakes. But really, I just happened to be lucky that my city had enough goods saved up to weather this storm of bad situations. In the end of the day, it's that feeling of stress as you try to juggle 5 glass balls at the same time that really makes the game shine. When the challenges of a city builder are mission-based and highly tailored for a difficulty curve, it makes the game take on a completely different feel from classic city builders, and one of the most rewarding gameplay experiences I've ever had the privilege of taking on. And the best part about it all is that each mission ends up feeling just different enough that you never feel the tedium of restarting a new city to be a chore. Every time you start, it's a new chance to build a cleaner, tighter, more efficient city as you gradually decide which building designs work best for your playstyle, and all the while adapting to the changing terrain and catastrophes that you'll have to deal with. See, every map is more than the sum of its parts as you start to notice the multiple catastrophes designed to simply shake up the status quo. Some of them are simple problems like a desert map having very little farmland or putting a valuable resource behind a set of natives that you have to pacify, but some of the problems are much more grandiose in nature. On the very final mission of the peace campaign, you're placed on a map with a bunch of farmland and tasked with selling grain to the rest of Rome, which will inevitably encourage you to use the easiest patch of farmland to reach on the map across the river. Then around 30 minutes into the scenario, once you've had the chance to put up a bunch of farms in that area, they trigger an earthquake that makes half of the farmland unusable. Combined with some other poor design choices on my first attempt on the map, and my unemployment went through the roof, causing riots across my entire city. Many beginning players lament that earthquakes and invasions are hard to play around without knowing where they'll hit ahead of time, but over the course of the game you'll begin to anticipate these situations and play conservatively ahead of time so that you can quickly adapt to collapsing iron mines or the unexpected wrath of the gods. With experience, these situations where your gladiators start a rebellion or you have to inherit a rundown city from the last governor who failed his task quickly become welcome surprises and new experiences. The most common catastrophe that the game throws at you are military invasions, which become so common over the course of the military campaign that catastrophe is probably not the right word to use here. I tend to throw them in with the environmental disasters since it quickly becomes a case of did you or did you not prepare enough for this situation type of checks. The reason it becomes yes or no checks is that the combat in the game is a fine spectacle, but ultimately very simple. Units attack other units they come into contact with, so you either try to guide your blob of units into enemy blob of units, or position your blob of units in the path of movement of the enemies so you can get a surround on them while they trickle into your formations. The problem with it all is that none of the invasions are really so big that you are supposed to have a problem with them, as long as you are building your city quick enough. I think there's a variety of reasons why the invasions were never a problem for me, but one of the biggest problems I ever ran into was that they just ramp up way too slowly. One of the largest invasions in the game happens on the map Mediolanum in the year 204 BC, but I never ended up seeing this giant invasion force at all since I ended up beating the map by the year 210 BC, and this seemed to be a common occurrence along the military campaign since I finished most missions relatively early as I crossed the peace threshold, since the prosperity ratings were so much easier to reach in comparison to the peaceful campaigns. It wasn't like I was trying that hard to rush through the levels, but I was beating them with some of the shortest time investments that you could theoretically push on these scenarios, which ended up making the entire series of missions easier since I never really saw any of the end game invasions on each map. Most cases, I far outnumbered my opponents simply by focusing on building military units at almost every point in the game, since I was always expecting things to ramp up, but never really saw it come to happen. On most of the later maps, the only reason I would build walls and towers was to buy time and make sure that my main force would have time to trek halfway across the map in order to reach the enemy in the first place. Simply placing a rank of infantry in front, followed by some javelins and then some ballista along the walls, really seemed to trivialize the combat, and the only true point I was challenged by the whole system was when I let my units get out-positioned or failed to catch the enemy in time. The absolute worst examples of this happened on one of my earlier military maps when I assumed the enemy would attack the west side of my city, but they instead decided to attack in the east, and with a poorly timed save game I just could not get my slow legionnaires to the area in time. After a couple of reloads, I eventually used all the money I could to build a giant wall like 10 layers deep and fortified by prefectures of all things, and was able to buy enough time to get my troops there. But realistically, the only thing this taught me was that I had to center my forces better and catch the enemy troops before they could reach my structures, because walls were much better used as giant ballista farms than as actual defensive structures. Despite the lack of difficulty to the combat, I found that I really enjoyed the spectacle of it all, watching waves of natives, elephants, and camel archers break against my impenetrable Roman forces. It really felt like the combat played to the strengths of our modern perceptions of the Roman turtle, with the idea that as long as I could set up my forces ahead of time, it didn't matter what the odds looked like, I would win. It also happened to be a nice little distraction from the constant city building, with the knowledge that in most cases I could just throw my defensive line along the closest route between the enemy and my city, speed up time for a couple of seconds, and watch the enemy limp away after losing the battle, like they had just run into a wall if there were any left alive at all. Ironically, this simple combat system also draws your focus to the strengths of Caesar instead of being a distraction from the city building aspects. Throughout all of this, I was finding all the combat encounters so easy, specifically because I had made the choice on these maps to slow my city growth and focus on building an army and defenses ahead of time instead of trying to scramble at the last second. Every military map with 6 full forts represents 6,000 denarii, in addition to the cost of all the military academies and the opportunity cost of throwing 16 sets of weapons into the hand of 1 unit of legionaries instead of selling them off. Spending around 10,000 denarii worth of money, manpower, and resources would inevitably slow down the expansion of my city, but the security it gave me in the long term, as it trivialized any invasions, ended up providing such a strong sense of satisfaction that the cost was worth it in my mind. I don't think the military campaign is the best one to start with, since the size constraints in most of the cities along this path really forced me to know what I was doing and the best way to fit multiple blocks within awkward shapes of land that the peace campaign usually didn't have to deal with. Ironically, the peace campaign also introduces warfare in a much better fashion by giving you an entire campaign's worth of pitiful invasions that you'll never really have to stress about, as well as teaching you the best ways to develop and fund a military early on in each mission. But once I had the game knowledge and experience from the complete peace campaign, the military side of things was a welcome sense of fresh air compared to the long slogs I had become accustomed to as I tried to reach 80 prosperity along the banks of Masilla. What took me 45 hours to complete the first campaign vanished in a weekend as I tackled the military campaign and breezed through with victory after victory within 22 hours the second time along. I cannot stress enough how good it felt to just have a relaxing time with the game after learning the basic concepts in a more free-flow environment the first time around. One of the reasons that the second playthrough took so much shorter to complete was due to the fact that I ended up developing a sort of gameplay flowchart as I progressed through levels. Instead of looking at a new map and letting the industries grow over time, I started planning everything at the very beginning. I'd find the wolves on a new map and trap them in place with wells so I didn't have to deal with them until I was ready, then analyze where I thought there was a good place to put a bunch of housing blocks, preferably close to a farmland to give them food. Next, I would open up the trading map and determine which industries had to be set up as quickly as possible in order to get some money flowing into the city, usually either weapons, furniture, or olives, since those would also serve as a good dump for any unemployment. And eventually you start being able to visualize your reservoir placement ahead of time, as well as starting to figure out efficient ways to use aqueducts without interrupting too many farmlands or housing blocks. You also start to determine your own rules of play at this point, because at the beginning it's best to stick to 9x9 and 7x7 blocks due to their efficiency and water use, but eventually you might decide on 8x10 blocks or larger depending on the needs of the map. I got into the habit of putting down a whole set of temples every time the game would pop up with a population marker screen, since the majority of the time I just didn't want to be bothered by the entire god system. And admittedly, the gods were a focal point in Roman culture, leading to half the solar system being named after the gods like Jupiter, Venus, and Mars, but Caesar 3 takes it just a little bit outside of reality in order to allow the gods to actually affect the game world. Most of the effects are a little mundane, like having your crops die or warehouses suddenly going empty if you upset the gods, but some of them have real ramifications, like Mars inciting groups of natives to rebel against your city very on in a map if you're not careful enough about paying attention to him. On the flip side, you can throw funds and resources like wine into a festival in order to try and appease a god or two, while you try to set up the religious infrastructure in order to maintain their worship. Most of the boons the gods send are just as mundane as the penalties, but Mars once again wins out by literally smiting down an entire enemy force that's been sent to kill you. The implementation of it all is a bit wonky, since this boon won't end up triggering until the enemy makes contact with something, but the end result of seeing a field of skeletons suddenly appear is pretty cool nonetheless. Anyways, I think that the coolest factor in appeasing the gods happens to be the fact that they will get jealous of each other if you don't worship them all equally. So theoretically, even if you had more than enough temples to normally satisfy the gods, if only one god happens to have more working temples than the rest, then they would inevitably get upset with you out of jealousy, despite having enough temples per 100 citizens or so. And while this is a cool implementation in theory, it often just means that whenever you set up a new temple, you'll just throw up one to each god in order to make sure that they all have equal representation. The only problem I ended up running into is when things go poorly and suddenly one or two temples catch on fire without you noticing, and eventually drawing the ire of these newly jealous gods. Returning to my ideas on the flow of the game, it always feels like there's something new you have to be doing, since the balance of population can be so wavy in its implementation. You never want population to be too high, since high unemployment leads to riots that will torch out half your city, and you also want to avoid going into a worker shortage, since trying to micromanage where the workforce allocates is a pretty fiddly system. To combat this, I found that I would commonly swing from 20% unemployment to a worker shortage back and forth as I ramped up different industries and culture projects in order to use my population, and then inevitably overdid it and put down too much industry for the current situation. This all resulted in a one more project type of mentality similar to the Civilization games, only without the long end-turn processing that can throw you out of your focus. And even in those short situations where it didn't feel absolutely pressing to complete one task or another, I would simply find myself speeding up time to 500% for a couple of seconds before the next task quickly became evident. After setting up all the basic structures for a new town, it was simply a question of weaving back and forth over this unemployment line as I worked on building up the population to the mission requirements and setting up the late game industries like wine, olives, and 3 types of food that I would eventually need in order to develop the top tier palaces in the game. As I neared the end of a mission, the absolute last thing I would do in most cases was set up a single block of elite housing in order to meet the prosperity requirements, which ended up being one of the most challenging portions of each map. I think that setting up this elite housing is probably the hardest part of Caesar 3 because it requires such a different method of thinking when compared to the rest of the game. Standard housing usually focuses on responding to problems by right-clicking on housing and determining what new resource or utility needed to be brought to a block in order to level it up. But with elite housing, they have so many requirements that you really have to know about most of them ahead of time in order to hope of consistently meeting their expectations. I ended up trying a couple of different setups, like evolving inside block housing and reversing it so that all the entertainment was placed on the inside of the block, but none of these setups worked especially well in the end. Later in the military campaign, when I started using one-lane elite housing blocks, I finally discovered a system that helped me maintain consistency with my palaces. Using the one-lane housing method certainly wasn't the most efficient method in terms of walker manipulation, since it will never double walker distance on the route back home, but for the small number of palaces you might need on each map, consistency was much less of a focus for me. All in all, the one-lane elite housing seems simple enough, but it actually ends up using some of the more complicated bugs and exploits in the game in order to make things work. The fascinating thing about bugs in Caesar 3 is that it's actually hard to tell whether or not they are in fact intentional design decisions. Take for example the infamous emigration glitch on very hard difficulty, where every city will begin losing workers between the population of 200 and 300, forcing players to build complex mazes in order to try and manipulate immigrants to break through the pop limit and get above 300 people on most maps. It certainly seems like a glitch, since lowering the taxes to 0 and increasing their wages seem to have no effect on the happiness of the people for that short time period, but it might actually be an intentional feature, as the new town happiness buff wears off when you reach 200 population. Likewise, you can also use the buildings that train actors and lion tamers to send entertainment walkers to blocks and areas that don't necessarily have the prerequisite entertainment for certain housing levels. Take for example this palace block that has evolved to the highest level in the game, yet doesn't have a single theater, amphitheater, coliseum, or hippodrome on the street. Instead, I found that using destination entertainment walkers to be much more effective for producing consistent culture ratings on elite housing due to their unique nature. The problem is that what initially seems like a bug could also be an intentional feature, since the walkers produced by these buildings are exactly the same as their final destination counterparts, and as such work the same. Theoretically, we might know for sure if the game had a more in-depth tutorial section, or even just a help menu in the game to better explain things, but instead these are just some of the tips and tricks that people ended up figuring out over time as they sunk countless hours into refining their cities in the game. Once again, the consistent challenge represented by Caesar 3 elevates this critical thinking and almost requires players to think outside of the box in order to even meet the bare minimum standards for some of the win conditions. It also ended up providing a depth of complexity for players to explore as they took the game outside of the main campaigns and into the sandbox mode. In Caesar 3, they ended up calling this mode the City Construction Kit on the main menu, but basically it's a set of 12 maps with no set end goals for you to just play around with, like a more typical SimCity type of scenario. While some of the maps that you can use in this mode happen to have the same names as maps from the main game, like Lugdunum or Carthago, all of the maps in this mode are actually different from their originals and only take after their original in their general feel and theme of the original map, such as Lugdunum having hard to reach farmland and cramped spaces, while Carthago only has a small amount of available farmland but abundant fishing waters and trade routes. While I personally haven't spent much time in the construction kit mode, many people have over the years and came up with some really interesting results based on what they like to do. I think one of the most interesting examples of this happens to be a person named Tio Alida, who ended up coming back to Caesar 3 for about a decade after its release, simply working on different ways to maximize the population number possible on different free play maps. I really think that his or her articles over on tiolita.com are worth a read yourself if you're at all invested in Caesar 3, but in summary, they found out that the housing caps out at 2,000 buildings per map, and the most efficient use of this space lies in the construction of large casas across the entire map. We're talking about population caps that ended up reaching over 50,000, which is pretty impressive compared to the max population requirement of 10,000 in the largest cities on the base campaign. Some of their other projects also happen to include using the map editor that you can download online to make their own custom maps and figure out the highest populations possible on the smallest map sizes in the game. Ultimately, that map editor also happens to be a fine tool for anyone who wants to try their own hand at either making a utopia city or some more unique scenarios available for download over on Caesar Haven. Some of these player-created maps are simple sandbox mode maps for you to play around with, while others present you with more detailed scenarios like the imminent invasion of a pre-built city that you're tasked with defending. One of the biggest projects on Caesar 3 also happens to be the gameplay that you've been watching this entire video in the complete recreation of the game called Project Julius. The mod upreses the entire game to work in 1080p and larger resolutions for modern computers, while keeping as many of the core gameplay mechanics the same. It also fixes many of the major issues with the game, like the music turning itself off after it runs out of tracks, and giving you the option to turn off bugs like the emigration glitch in very hard mode. You can also find several quality of life improvements that go a long way towards modernizing the game, like the inclusion of an option to build temples of consecutive types without having to go back to the religious tab each time to pick the next one, or an option to turn on a visual water radius for reservoirs, fountains, and wells. While not all of these additional features ended up working perfectly all the time, the mere inclusion of them as an option made a genuine improvement to the gameplay feel as I completed the peace campaign on the original settings. Perhaps one of the best improvements for any Caesar 3 fan is the inclusion of a win condition sidebar on the main gameplay screen, which allows you to see everything you might want to know at all times instead of forcing you to go into the advisor's menu every couple of minutes to check unemployment. In the base game, there was already an option to right-click on any walker in the city and they could tell you the general status of what needs doing, like getting more housing or less unemployment, but the sidebar at least gives you more concrete information like how many personnel you're short and the stat numbers you'll need in order to win in parentheses. Ultimately, I would recommend that every modern player pick up Julius, if only for the up-res options that allow you to see much more than a couple buildings at any one time on the screen. I've mentioned the story a little bit in passing already, but suffice to say that the story for the main campaign is pretty bare bones. The only real dialogue comes in the form of these spoken introductions at the beginning of each mission during the campaign.
In the interest of advancing your education, I have one more gentle assignment for you. Onward to Brundisium.
Despite their quick runtime, the mission introductions happen to be stock full of flavor and voice on large part due to the talent of the voice actors who portray them. On some days you'll be addressed by Caesar himself as he confides in you a wish to find a successor to the throne.
I have wanted to retire for some years now, but lacking an heir, I need to find a worthy successor. Prove yourself this one last time, and the ultimate prize is yours.
Or, more often, you'll simply be addressed by his right-hand man since the Emperor is out on vacation and can't be bothered with city management.
Caesar is presently returning from a trip to Carthago, where he met with the province's governor. A messenger from the Emperor arrived just this morning. Caesar commands me, his proconsul for Roma, to present you with the following instructions.
Each new city raises the stakes and mission requirements and then goes on to address those expectations at the end of the introduction voiceover.
Create a city of no fewer than 7,000 souls within sight of the Alps. Furthermore, I expect you to achieve higher levels of prosperity and culture than you have done so far, although your goals are still only moderately high. I grant you a huge, fertile province in which to build a major port city, to be called Londinium. In keeping with the richness of this new province, I expect you to achieve very high ratings.
What's odd is that some written parts are not even included in the voiceover, and other parts of the voiceover address game concepts in a way that is realistic but doesn't necessarily match up with what actually happens in the gameplay.
Your priorities should be security, housing, food, and water in that order. Without housing and food, new immigrants will not move into your city.
What the game lacks in any true narrative, it makes up for with the sheer force of catchiness to its soundtrack, as I found myself humming along to the music for hours on end. The fact that the music evolves over time, growing in scope and grandeur as you reach specific population milestones, only adds to the ambiance as you come closer and closer to your end goals. that there were more tracks in the game because the same repetitive nature that left the main theme running in my head almost every moment of the day might also be the game's downfall for anyone that doesn't like this particular tune. I make no claims to having a critical ear when it comes to musical production, but what is there certainly matched the Roman theme and aged relatively well despite the compression it inevitably had to make on a game from its time. It might just be me, but I absolutely adored the British voice acting for all the characters in the game. There's a certain feeling of it all just fitting together quite nicely, which goes against your expectations when you realize that the Romans probably would have had a more Italian English accent than a British one in real life. It could theoretically be justified by the conquering of Old Britain, but even then, the English language was never even created in its basic forms until 500 AD, long after the events of Caesar III, and whatever. All the accents seem natural on the characters in the game, from the less cultured new immigrants to the city.
I'm new to this place. Do you know of anywhere to live?
To the very poshness and gravity of Caesar himself.
I am weary. Do not disappoint me now, with the final prize in your sight.
A large part of this contextual consistency probably results from the loving recreation of Roman streets on the visual side of things. While the game is noticeably old from first glance, a lot of that aging is a side effect from the clunky UI setup that takes up half of the screen. And the actual art behind the housing levels, buildings, and walkers is still surprisingly appealing to look at, even so many years later. And this only gets amplified as you start to see the entire city begin to take shape and flow along the roads. Some of the best features of the art in this game is the implementation of animations in order to tell whether buildings are working or not. Some, like the prefecture and engineers post putting up flags, are relatively simple, while others, like the granary, will literally show you the stock of food inside of it from the windows, are much more functional. Some of my favorite, like the furniture workshops being put to work, give you a good idea whether you need more timber suppliers, and the fact that your workshops will literally visually represent how many goods you have available of what types is a genuinely useful effect. Added to this, you can literally watch the housing evolve from shanty tents to small hovels to brick houses and high-density duplexes, and finally into the marble-infused villas and grand palaces. The sheer scope of these changes over a couple of hours per map give the real feeling of growth to your city, since your housing blocks will gradually evolve and reflect the stability or instability of your city. The fact that even the roads and fountains will change appearance based on the general desirability of the surrounding area is like the whipped cream on top of it all, since it absolutely serves no purpose other than positive reinforcement for your success or failures. And despite all of this visual flavor, they still managed to make the game easy to read by giving those characters that you need to locate most vibrant tells in order to find them quickly and easily, even among the city as a whole. Merchant women on their way to get goods are easily identifiable by their glowing green skirts, while the engineers that keep your buildings from falling down can be easily seen via the tall ladder that rests on their shoulder as you determine exactly how far down the street they are actually traveling. Likewise, the school children and priests dressed in white are so well camouflaged with the color of the streets and houses behind them that they kind of just blend into the background, identifying the fact that you don't really need to track their movements as closely as the red and gold firemen who literally keep your city from burning down. Likewise, the predominantly red military troops at your command are always easy to locate in your city, even as they pass single file through close gaps in order to quickly locate and give them new commands to change their direction of travel. In this case, especially, the old pixel art exaggerated character approach really helped make things identifiable at a single glance, so that you could easily tell exactly where your city was succeeding and failing appropriately. And in the case that something isn't represented via the in-game visuals, the game also comes stocked with a separate visual overlay in order to track any type of building or metric in the game. For example, when on the food stores overlay, it will minimize every other building in the game so that you can quickly see every single granary and fruit production facility on the map, as well as seeing the pathing of all their respective cart pushers. Likewise, the water overlay is one of the most useful ones on the game that I would often default to in order to easily see which houses are getting water and which areas you can place working fountains and bathhouses to satisfy the people. These overlays also represent more abstract things like throwing the map into a colorful representation of where decor and desirability is strong or weak depending on the surrounding buildings. Or while building around the native camps, you might want to turn on the natives overlay in order to see their aggro radius and determine the best routes to send your emissaries on in order to quell their rebellious spirit. I rarely used many of the entertainment and education overlays, but those are also included as a quick management tool for anyone that finds themselves stuck in a loop without their city evolving for a reason they can't determine. Ultimately, this is only a small thing that probably didn't need to be included, but it's the small little details like this that really make the game approachable, since all the information is available to the player as long as you know what to do with it. It's because of this amplitude of information that the few points in the game where the advisors don't remind you about things are the most annoying. The most noticeable point where this comes into effect are the requests for troops to defend an allied city. While most favors to Rome include yearly reminders that you need to fulfill them, the one task that usurps this norm happens to be allied invasions, which may be one of the worst explained aspects in the entire game. In essence, you sometimes get requests to send away forces to defend against either a small or average-sized enemy force, and you only have 24-ish months in order to send those defensive troops out. In practice, what they don't tell you is that the success rate is not based upon the strength of your troops, but rather on the number of forts that you decide to send on the trip. The event also fails to explain that it is entirely possible to click the button to send troops, but find out that it was too late and they were never able to reach the city in time, or the opposite, and you sent too few troops that ended up dying on the field of battle despite the lack of any real risk with similar numbers on your own city. To add to this, if you fail to remember to send out troops at all because you forgot about it among the 10 other tasks you're working on at the same time, then Caesar's opinion of you will drop to 0 and he will immediately start sending his legions in order to try and arrest you, which may or may not have bricked one of my attempts on a peace campaign mission where I had no chance of raising my favor rating back up into the green. It's not that the event itself was hard to complete in any manner, but rather that because it was one of the least explained aspects of the game, I found myself consistently failing these requests out of a sheer lack of experience with the game. Thankfully, over the course of both campaigns, this event only pops up 5 or 6 times and doesn't punish you too harshly unless you fail to send troops at all. As I start to wind my way out of this analysis, I'd like to put the game into the context of where it came from and where it ended up going eventually. The studio behind Caesar 3 was called Impressions Games, founded by David Lester in 1989 and bought by Sierra Entertainment in 1995, which later became Vivendi Studios when it merged with Davidson in 2001. This meant that over the course of the last couple years that Impression Gaming still existed, they happened to be owned by the same company that owned Blizzard Entertainment, and back in 1998 when Caesar 3 first came out, they actually surpassed the profits of Blizzard. As such, the success of Caesar 3 led the studio to make 3 follow-up games by the names of Pharaoh, Zeus, and Emperor, with various additions and changes to the status quo of gameplay established by Caesar. While Pharaoh and Zeus are also available for sale on Steam, while the team was working on Emperor, there were multiple management changes that resulted in the game being co-developed by Breakaway Games, and the resulting licensing problems the game runs into when trying to find it today. Meanwhile, Impressions was then working on what would be their last game, which went by the title Lords of the Realm 3. It was due to the poor reception for their final game that Vivendi Universal had to close up Impression Games, along with several other studios, as the company encountered financial problems around April 2004, and ending the Walker system of games first introduced by Caesar 3. Many of the developers on Impression staff would go on to found Tilted Mill Entertainment, which came out with a sequel with the 2006 Caesar 4, but the compromises that had to be made in order to move the game into 3D pushed away a lot of the old school fans for the game. Today, Tilted Mill still happens to be in operation and has been working on a new city builder called Medieval Mayor, which has encountered several development problems and may not even still be under production at this time. Another spin-off studio from the original Impressions games was founded by Simon Bradley in 1999 and was named Firefly Studios. Coming from the success of Caesar 3 and Pharaoh, this small team ended up building the Stronghold series, which makes sense as a more polished evolution of the same theories that went into the creation of Caesar 3. In those games, while they don't rely on the Walker system for satisfaction of needs, all the resource gathering and storing is simulated via real-time characters creating and moving goods, much like the Impression system of City Builder, although the combat in the Stronghold series was revamped to the point where many people would call it the focal point of those titles. I think that the true value behind the game systems introduced by Caesar 3 is truly self-evident in the fact that it went on to inspire 3 separate follow-on games along with several expansions. This was also vindicated by a generally good critical response among reviewers from the time, which often claimed that the only shortcoming for the game was its combat system, which is a justified response. Despite the fact that many sequels that refined on the core design of Caesar exist, even decades later, many people like myself are more than eager to dive back into the world that Caesar 3 created. It wasn't just the challenge of it or the depth of the systems that defines this title, but also the general theme established by the game, since I truly challenge you to find another game that gives players such a grandiose feeling of Roman culture as Caesar 3. Even the Total War series that dedicated several games to the Roman setting only ever succeeded at establishing the feeling of Rome as a country, but never the individual appeal of each Roman city. Now, I've played Rome Total War several times in the past, but I only ever remember the names of her enemies and not the mountain ridges of Lugdunum, or the desert oasis in Damascus, nor the island paradise of Miletus. For that very feeling of connection with every city I built, this game is unique and deserves to be remembered fondly. If you want to continue watching more gameplay for Caesar 3, you should head over to Gamer Zakhs, who specializes in taking a look at games from our childhood via Let's Plays, as well as putting together several amazing tutorial videos on how to get better on this type of city builder. If you'd like to watch more long-term video essays on video games, please check out my critiques on Dungeon Siege, or check out some other amazing creators like King K, Strat Edgy, and Raycevick in the details below this video. Likewise, if you have any content creators for long-term video game analysis you want to suggest to me, throw it in the comments below. I'd honestly love to be able to tell you what game I want to do an essay on next, but the best laid plans of mice and men are often led astray, and opinion pieces like this need to be something that you really feel strongly about in order to put together something of value. So, as always, leave a like, subscribe, and I hope to catch you in another video. Thank you. Okay, so notes from the editor time here. This video is obviously a remake of one of my earlier critiques, which just didn't have a good enough audio quality to stand the test of time and provide a good experience. If you want to check out what it used to sound like, I left a link in the description below, but I specifically needed to go back and remaster the audio for this critique, since some of my future projects were going to reference my feelings about Caesar 3 as one of the best city builders that I know. Apart from that, I left the script and video cuts for the critique mostly unchanged, since most of the things I felt about Caesar 3 are still obviously true. And while I think that the quality of my writing has improved over time, by making this into a simple audio remaster, it helps cut down on the amount of time that it takes to change the video, letting me continue to put out newer critiques at the same time. So don't worry about the WoW critique that will be coming out shortly after this one. That being said, I'll probably have to go back and do a similar audio remaster for the Dungeon Siege video at some point, but I don't really have a timetable for that project in mind. Hopefully this was still an entertaining critique to watch, since I understand the fact that it's basically the moral equivalent to reposting a meme, but with higher quality. So we'll see if more than 280 people end up watching it this time around, and other than that, time for some bloopers. Thanks for watching. In summary, they found out that the general appeal of most city builders lies in the sandbox. This becomes a true learning challenge. Ew. Every time. Yep. First comes whatever. Hell, I was working the luxury palace half of my city and ew. Sushi burps. Gross. But some of them have real ramifications, like Mars inciting groups of natives to Like Mars inciting groups of natives. Ugh. But some of them have real ramifications, like Mars inciting groups of But the end result of seeing a field of skeletons suddenly appear is pretty cool nonetheless. Later in the military campaign, I started using one-lane elite housing blocks in the game to better explain things, but instead these are just some of the tips and trips. Some of the best features of the art in this game is the implementation of animations and bought by Sierra Entertainment in 1995, which later became Vivendi Studios.